I'm not sure where I got cut off the last video, but I assume it was right after I finished the footnote. So, Descartes decreed that the extended substance was purely mechanical, ruled by efficient causes alone. This included our own living bodies. But once we come to see that our experience is rooted in bodily processes, and not in some invisible mental substance existing beyond it, attributing genuine interiority and teleology to other living bodies is simply a matter of generalizing our own embodiment. We need not relapse into the tacit presupposition of the mind with its private ideas, which are in fact qualities without intelligible connection to the entities represented. End quote. It's Whitehead from Processing Reality. But how far can this generalization of our own experience be taken? Varela, while he grants that teleology is more than an artifact of the human mind, only reestablishes it as a necessary phenomenological fact about our own embodied experience. To firmly root teleology, and therefore formal and final causes, in organisms themselves, Varela must establish an ontological principle, not merely describe a phenomenological given. It appears he is willing to do just that. To speak, quote, of autopoiesis thus directly links the biological sphere with a teleological account of ontology. On a material, concrete level, we can observe in the organism the flip side of mechanical causality. A final causality as the basic process of life itself. The establishment of an identity. But this happens not by revising physical laws for particle interactions and special application to organisms, nor by imposing an extra mechanical entelechy. It is rather the subject pole that is the organism in its autonomy, which changes linear causality by structuring matter in the process of self-realization to maintain itself as this very process. End quote. Exploring this process of the formation of a subject pole brings us closer to Whitehead, whose analysis of the general character of experience in terms of concrescence provides us with the platform necessary to understand how organisms don't need to transcend the neutrality of pure physics, because there never was a purely neutral physics to begin with. But before we move on to Whitehead's analysis of cosmological process, we must examine with Gebser the underlying reasons for the acceptance of mechanism as a complete account of life, and the necessary mutation in thought that must accompany any overcoming of such false limitations. The task of the integral structure is to free time from the cage the mind attempted to trap it in as it went about conquering space with measurement. This false spatialization of time allowed the towering system of Newton to stand for several centuries. But, quote, at last the Newtonian cosmology has broken down, end quote, of Whitehead. Erecting such a system was possible only after Descartes had, quote, decisively separated mind from matter, end quote, Whitehead again. This separation led Newton to conceive of atoms as, quote, devoid of self-enjoyment, end quote, as mind was present only in the human, who through conscious deliberation imposed upon a dead cosmos the clarity and distinctness of its innate ideas. As Gebser puts it, quote, the process of consolidating space consciousness. In the process of consolidating space consciousness, man has precariously placed himself at the outermost reaches of all manifestations. He brought about the isolation of the human, leaving it only matter as its valid support. Whitehead recognizes that human mentality, quote, human mentality is an extreme instance of those happenings which constitute nature, end quote, but is at pains to remind us that unless we wish to exempt humanity from the course of natural things by admitting an uneasy dualism, we must generalize our experience such that it applies to every occasion in the cosmos. Failing to do so leads to a rigidification in which, as Gebser says, quote, consciousness increasingly empties itself of the time it has negated, which, as a result of this attitude, itself becomes a lifeless spatial component. And the quantified motoricity of the machine and its lifelessness are in turn merely another expression of a spatialized concept of time. The danger in falsely spatializing time, of which we have given so much attention, is not only that it replaces the transparency of our experience with a vicious dualism, but that this dualism results in our attempt to make measurable every phenomenon we are faced with, even when such measurement, as in the case of a living organism, fractures its qualitative intensity of experience into abstract, particulate quantities. Quote, intensities, unless we mistake them for pressure or tension, are not measurable, end quote. It's Gebser. The result is that its animate presence is reduced to the motions of a machine, its being an organism, lacking feeling, empty of experience, and devoid of purpose. The materialism and mechanization still in vogue in contemporary biology are a result of a failure to assimilate the transformation occurring within physics over the past century. As we discussed earlier, Darwin's reduction of the apparent design of species to the accidental mechanism of variation under natural selection was based on the fundamental assumption that space, time, and matter were Newtonian in nature. While his theory was undoubtedly empirically sound, it is often the case that, quote, we have to rescue the facts as they are from the facts as they appear. Darwin selected from among the facts appearing to him only those most prominent for his thoroughly Newtonian mind. As a result, the animate presence of the creatures he sought to understand was ignored, overlaid by the abstract rationalizations favored by the mental structure. Time, for Newton as for Darwin, played merely a quantitative role. It was the space, conceived of as a fourth dimension, that allowed one moment, a fixed instant, to pass into the next, equally as instantaneous and having no intrinsic relation to the one prior to or following it, but for the exchange of forces by way of efficient causation. There's a footnote. Henry Bergson refers to this way of understanding time as the, quote, cinematographical method. Quote, instead of attaching ourselves to the inner becoming of things, we place ourselves outside them in order to recompose their becoming artificially, end quote. This collapse of time into a spatial sequence, each snapshot externally and accidentally related to the next, vanquished the concrete temporal intensity required for formal and final causes to play their role. From Darwin's point of view, the admission of teleology and evolution was absurd, because it implied that the future had causal influence on the past. Time, so conceived, is entirely accidental, and so what happens in the future can only be a direct result of what happened in the past, an aggregate of instants piled one on top of the other, species gaining their form along the way from the accumulation of chance mutations surviving the differential selection of a pre-given environment. This may be an explanation for the diversity of species, but not for life itself, for reasons given in a prior section, that the process presupposes self-organization. But more than that, it retards a full account of life because the formal and final causes of autopoiesis stem from, quote, the opposed doctrine of internal relation, which is distorted by reason of its description in terms of language adapted to the presupposition of external relations of the Newtonian type, end quote. As Whitehead. Darwin imagined that all relations between occasions are external, but concrete time is not decomposable into the static categories of past, present, and future, each excluding the other. Teleology is not a matter of the future causing the past, but of the future and the past being immanent in the present experience of every occasion. Formal and final causation are relevant only for the internal relations between the parts of an organism, and between the organism and its environment, which Darwin mistakenly assumed could only be related externally. As Whitehead says, evolution on the materialistic theory is reduced to the role of being another word for the description of the changes of the external relations between portions of matter. There is nothing to evolve, because one set of external relations is as good as any other set of external relations. There can be merely change, purposeless and unprogressive.